February 19, 1945. The first pale light of dawn crept over the volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima. A low fog clung to the jagged black sand beaches, shrouding the chaos that was about to erupt. Across the horizon, the dark silhouettes of American landing craft crested the waves, engines churning through the Pacific swell, their metal hulls glinting with the rising sun. Inside each Higgins boat, Marines gripped rifles and bayonets, faces set like carved stone, hearts pounding to the rhythm of imminent battle. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in a labyrinth of caves and pillboxes, peered through narrow slits, their eyes narrowing in disbelief at the sheer audacity of what they were about to witness. The Americans would not merely arrive, they would arrive relentlessly. And the men inside those fortified positions could not fathom it. For hours, minutes, perhaps even a lifetime, the soldiers of the Empire of Japan had prepared for an onslaught, expecting hesitancy, retreat, fear. But what confronted them now was a tide of steel and flesh that refused to pause. As the first landing craft slammed into the surf, artillery fire tore across the sand, hurling plumes of blackened debris skyward. The air vibrated with the roar of naval guns from the distant battleships, their shells striking with terrifying precision. Smoke coiled and twisted, masking movements, turning the beach into a living, breathing entity of chaos. American Marines surged forward through the surf, their uniforms soaked, weapons weighed down by water, yet their determination unyielding. Japanese riflemen opened fire from concealed bunkers, bullets spitting like angry hornets, yet the Americans pushed on. Wave after wave hit the beach, as if the sea itself conspired with them, each man a cog in a relentless machine. Japanese machine gunners, faces etched with disbelief, fired until their barrels grew red-hot. Yet the invaders pressed forward, crawling over sand, over fallen comrades, over the razor-thin edge between life and death. The Japanese had drilled for this moment, rehearsing defense strategies with precision born of obsession. They had fortified every ridge, every crater, every hidden nook with painstaking care. Mortars were preloaded, flamethrowers primed, and artillery positions camouflaged with volcanic rock and twisted steel. Yet as the Americans advanced, it became painfully clear that this was not the battle they had anticipated. Coordination between the Marines was something almost supernatural to the entrenched soldiers. Small units communicated in a language of hand signals, shouted commands, and radios that seemed to cut through the chaos like a scalpel. Every maneuver was synchronized, every assault coordinated, each Marine aware of his position in the living network that surged forward. The Japanese could not believe the speed, the precision, the audacity of the assault. Through the dense smoke and salt spray, the chaos revealed patterns almost invisible to the untrained eye. The Marines moved with terrifying efficiency, bounding from cover to cover, using the natural contours of the beach and the wreckage of demolished bunkers to shield themselves from return fire. Explosions threw sand and shrapnel into the air, yet each man seemed to absorb the violence around him and convert it into forward motion. The Japanese defenders began to panic. Orders shouted down wire lines were met with confusion as machine gunners fell. Communications were severed, and pre-calculated fields of fire became irrelevant in the face of an enemy that refused to stop. Fear is a slow killer, yet here it spread with the velocity of a bullet, a psychological tide that no entrenched soldier could anticipate. Above, the sky was a theater of smoke and fire. Corsairs roared overhead, strafing bunkers, craters, and foxholes. Bombs from carrier planes exploded in brilliant orange blossoms, casting shadows that danced across the volcanic terrain. Marines ducked and rolled through the blast, their adrenaline tuned to a single purpose: seize the beach and do not stop. Every fallen comrade was replaced by another. Every position taken by one unit was immediately reinforced by the next. The Japanese had trained for an orderly, predictable fight. They had studied maps, calculated ranges, estimated reaction times. None of it mattered now. The Americans had introduced a new variable, relentless momentum. And as their tide pressed on, the defenders could only marvel at their audacity, their stamina, their horrifying unwillingness to yield. This relentless advance was no accident. American doctrine had evolved through the bitter lessons of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. Commanders had learned that hesitation was fatal, and that morale was a weapon as lethal as any artillery shell. The Marines were conditioned to operate as an extension of one another, a networked organism where initiative and obedience coexisted in perfect harmony. Leaders on the front lines communicated with small units, radios crackling through static, relaying orders, calling for support, and synchronizing assaults with a precision that turned chaos into opportunity. From a distance, Japanese observers saw these movements as uncanny, almost preternatural. How could such a human wave move with machine-like accuracy under fire? Their disbelief was compounded by the technical superiority that the Americans brought with them. Lighter rifles, more accurate mortars, flamethrowers capable of clearing bunkers without exposing the operator, and amphibious vehicles that could traverse the treacherous beach terrain without faltering. By mid-morning, the initial landing zones were secured, but the cost was staggering. Blood mingled with black sand, equipment lay in twisted wreckage, and the screams of the wounded echoed across the beach. Yet for every fallen Marine, another stepped into the breach, keeping the line moving forward. The Japanese defenders, many of whom had expected the attackers to falter under concentrated fire, were stunned. Their calculated fields of fire had been rendered useless. Their machine guns, mortars, and rifles could not stem the tide. For the first time, they experienced the psychological torment of facing an enemy that did not fear death, that did not pause to calculate, that moved as though propelled by an inexhaustible force. The horror of the relentless assault etched itself into the minds of every survivor, a memory that would haunt debriefs and diaries alike. The beach, once a calm expanse of volcanic sand and jagged rock, had been transformed into a tableau of destruction. Smoke, fire, and the acrid tang of cordite filled the air. The Marines continued their advance, clearing obstacles, neutralizing pillboxes, and establishing footholds in terrain that had been deemed impregnable. Japanese soldiers, crouched in caves or behind shattered walls, could only watch in stunned silence. Reports sent to higher command described an enemy that moved like a tide, striking where least expected, adapting instantly to changing circumstances. Even the most seasoned officers could not reconcile these reports with reality. How could an army so small, so vulnerable on the beaches, exert such overwhelming force, with such inexorable determination? The answer was clear in hindsight. Preparation, doctrine, and unbreakable morale converged to create a force that seemed to defy expectation and conventional wisdom. By the end of the first day, American forces had secured multiple beachheads, penetrating deeply into the volcanic interior. The Japanese, battered and demoralized, began a fighting withdrawal into the network of caves and tunnels that crisscrossed the island. Yet even in retreat, disbelief lingered. How had this enemy managed to survive, coordinate, and strike with such unyielding energy? Survivors would later recount moments where entire squads vanished into the smoke, only to reappear in positions they were not supposed to reach, their movements orchestrated with a precision that seemed impossible under the relentless chaos of battle. The Japanese could not understand it. They could only endure it, fight it, and in rare moments admire it. By nightfall, the beach was littered with the remnants of human will and mechanical ingenuity. Smoke rose from shell craters, flamethrower scars blackened the sand, and the roar of distant naval guns echoed like a grim lullaby. The Americans, exhausted but unbroken, consolidated positions, prepared for the next wave, and maintained a tempo that defied natural limits. Japanese soldiers, peering from the tunnels above, confronted a simple truth: the Marines would not stop. They could not comprehend the speed, coordination, and psychological fortitude that had brought these men ashore and driven them forward relentlessly. And in that moment, the first seeds of awe and terror were sown, laying the foundation for a battle that would become legendary in its display of human determination and the inexorable march of strategy, technology, and courage converging on a single, black sand shore. By 1945, the Pacific Theater had become a crucible where strategy, endurance, and innovation were tested to their limits. Japan, once the aggressor, had transformed into a nation fighting desperately to defend every island, every coastline, and every foothold that remained within its grasp. American forces, having suffered brutal campaigns at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, had refined a doctrine built on lessons forged in blood and fire. The Marines were no longer merely infantry. They were a highly trained, coordinated strike force, an organism capable of overwhelming the enemy through speed, adaptability, and relentless pressure. Commanders studied maps not just for topography, but for psychological impact, understanding that the terrain itself could be weaponized to break an enemy's morale. Iwo Jima, with its jagged volcanic ridges and labyrinthine caves, was not simply a target. It was a crucible designed to test the limits of men and machines alike. The Japanese had prepared meticulously. For months, engineers and soldiers transformed the island into a fortress that defied conventional assault. Bunkers reinforced with steel and concrete dotted the landscape, interlaced with miles of tunnels that allowed rapid movement and surprise attacks. Mortar positions were calculated to overlap fields of fire, creating deadly interlocking zones that any approaching force would have to traverse under near-constant bombardment. Flamethrowers and anti-tank obstacles were placed where they could inflict maximum casualties. Japanese doctrine, influenced by decades of military tradition and Bushido code, emphasized defense at all costs. Retreat was dishonorable, surrender unthinkable. Each soldier was a living barrier, a blade sharpened against the inevitability of death for the sake of national survival. Commanders expected the Americans to falter under this weight of preparation, yet they underestimated the evolution of American amphibious warfare. American doctrine, by contrast, was built on integration, coordination, and flexibility. Rather than relying on static defenses, U.S. Marines were trained to move as a synchronized organism, exploiting weaknesses in enemy fortifications with speed and precision. Small units were empowered to make rapid decisions, supported by a network of radios, artillery, and air power that could respond almost instantaneously to shifting conditions. This integration allowed the Marines to maintain momentum even under withering fire, turning the chaos of battle into an operational advantage. In essence, while the Japanese had prepared a fortress, the Americans had prepared a machine that adapted, learned, and pressed relentlessly. The resulting clash would pit tradition against innovation, static defense against dynamic assault, discipline against flexibility. The broader strategic picture added layers of complexity. The capture of Iwo Jima was not merely a tactical objective, it was a psychological and operational linchpin in the American campaign. Its airfields could provide a base for fighter escorts and emergency landings for bombers targeting the Japanese mainland. Victory here would shorten supply lines, reduce losses in the Philippines and Okinawa, and bring the war incrementally closer to Japan itself. For Japanese commanders, every inch of the island was a line in the sand, a territory that, if lost, could not be regained. Their calculations were precise, their confidence rooted in the belief that no enemy could sustain the intensity of a frontal assault against such well-prepared positions. Yet in this confidence lay the seeds of misjudgment, a fundamental underestimation of American adaptability and relentless operational tempo. American intelligence had studied previous engagements in the Pacific, analyzing patterns of Japanese defense and weaknesses in logistics and communication. Lessons learned at Tarawa, where Marines faced high casualties due to underestimating tidal conditions and the density of obstacles, informed meticulous planning for Iwo Jima. LVTs, amphibious tractors, were deployed to traverse beaches while armored support and engineers cleared obstacles in real time. Naval bombardments were calculated with precision to neutralize key positions without creating impassable rubble. Airstrikes were synchronized to support the initial landings and suppress enemy counterattacks. Every element of preparation was designed to sustain momentum and prevent the defenders from leveraging their intricate network of fortifications. In effect, the Americans turned intelligence, technology, and doctrinal evolution into a force multiplier, offsetting the raw tenacity of the Japanese defense. The Japanese, on the other hand, faced a complex psychological landscape. Their soldiers were aware of the reputation of the American Marines, their ability to endure, adapt, and press forward under conditions that would break ordinary men. Yet the doctrine of Bushido, emphasizing death before dishonor, required them to hold positions at all costs. The tension between expectation and reality created an environment where confusion and disbelief could spread quickly when plans failed to account for the Americans' unyielding pace. Commanders anticipated retreat or hesitation, but what confronted them was an enemy that pressed relentlessly, often coordinating assaults with technological aids the Japanese could not fully comprehend. Radios crackled across the battlefield, not with confusion but with precision, enabling rapid shifts in focus, artillery fire coordination, and reinforcement. For entrenched soldiers, this was more than tactical innovation. It was almost supernatural, a force that defied the traditional understanding of warfare. This mismatch in doctrine, preparation, and expectation defined the early hours of the Iwo Jima assault. On paper, Japanese defenses were formidable, meticulously calculated to inflict maximum casualties on any landing force. In practice, the human factor, the Marines' relentless momentum, the networked coordination of small units, and the integration of technology overrode many of the static advantages. Each bunker neutralized, each ridge seized, undermined the assumption that fortifications alone could dictate the course of battle. By the time the first full day concluded, the Japanese defenders were grappling with a horrifying realization: their tactical calculations, their engineering, their discipline, all could be negated by an opponent that moved faster, adapted quicker, and refused to stop. As the sun set over the black sand and volcanic ridges, the historical context of the battle became painfully evident. This was not merely a confrontation of men. It was a clash of doctrines, a collision between rigid preparation and flexible, relentless execution. The Japanese had expected a methodical assault, one that could be met with carefully timed counterattacks. Instead, they faced a storm calculated, precise yet unyielding, a reflection of lessons learned in previous Pacific campaigns and innovations in amphibious warfare that had matured over years of brutal testing. By embedding flexibility, coordination, and relentless tempo into every operation, the Americans had created an edge that the Japanese could neither anticipate nor counter, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test courage, endurance, and the very nature of modern warfare itself. The hidden advantage that would define the American assault on Iwo Jima was not immediately visible to the Japanese defenders. To them, the enemy appeared as a relentless wave of men, moving with uncanny synchronization across a landscape designed to resist every advance. What the Japanese could not see or fully comprehend was the intricate web of coordination, communication, and mobility that underpinned every Marine movement. Radios, once bulky and unreliable, had evolved into lightweight, dependable instruments that cut through static terrain and chaos, creating a battlefield orchestra where every unit played its part with precision. The Americans had deployed SCR-536 handy talkies at the squad level and SCR-300 backpacks for platoons, allowing instantaneous coordination that the Japanese had never encountered. Each radio was a lifeline, a conduit for real-time information that transformed chaos into calculated action, and it would be these invisible threads of connection that unhinged the Japanese defenders' expectations. From the moment the first landing craft touched the shore, Marines were in constant contact with one another and with forward observers. Spotters atop ridges relayed enemy positions via radio to coordinated artillery strikes, while small squads communicated with assault units to adjust movements and suppress fire. The Japanese had trained to anticipate frontal assaults and static bombardments, relying on fields of fire meticulously designed to decimate any predictable advance. Yet the Americans refused predictability. Their radios allowed split-second adjustments, enabling units to exploit weaknesses as they appeared, and to avoid the deadliest concentrations of fire. Japanese soldiers could see the results, entire positions neutralized before they could respond, but they could not discern how the attackers seemed always to anticipate the next defensive move. Confusion turned to frustration, frustration to disbelief. This advantage extended beyond simple coordination. The Marines' amphibious vehicles, light tanks, and LVTs carried not only troops, but essential supplies, allowing them to maintain a continuous offensive pace that defied Japanese expectations. In other theaters, defenders had relied on the hope that attrition and exhaustion would halt an attacking force. On Iwo Jima, the Americans had neutralized that assumption. Communication and logistics were intertwined, creating a system where resupply, reinforcement, and fire support occurred seamlessly. Engineers cleared obstacles in real time, coordinating with riflemen and flamethrower teams to ensure forward momentum was never lost. To the Japanese, the relentless pace of the assault seemed superhuman, as if every Marine were linked to an invisible conductor, orchestrating a symphony of destruction. The technology itself was remarkable. The SCR-300 backpack radio, developed by Motorola engineers in Chicago, weighed just 35 pounds, a fraction of earlier models, and could transmit over distances exceeding 3 miles in optimal conditions. Its voice-modulated FM signal cut through interference, static, and even the roar of artillery. Paired with the handheld SCR-536, a squad leader could coordinate movements across trenches, ridges, and landing beaches in real time. This was a level of battlefield integration that the Japanese had no comparable counterpart for. German engineers on the European front had relied on radio communication, but in the Pacific, terrain and technology had conspired to make such coordination nearly impossible for Japan. The Marines' radios did not merely transmit orders, they allowed instantaneous adaptation, a battlefield nervous system that connected every soldier, vehicle and artillery piece into a single, cohesive organism. The Japanese response to this invisible advantage was one of mounting disbelief. Officers attempting to direct fire found that positions they had expected to hold unchallenged were already neutralized, and that American forces appeared in unexpected locations with terrifying timing. Counterattacks were often misdirected because information arrived too late or was rendered obsolete by the Marines' rapid maneuvers. To entrenched defenders, it seemed as though the Americans had foresight, anticipating every trap, every obstacle, every defensive maneuver. Reports from field commanders describe moments where entire ridges appeared to be abandoned by the enemy 1 second, only to be reoccupied moments later by another coordinated strike, a phenomenon made possible by the interplay of radio communication, small unit initiative, and real-time battlefield intelligence. Beyond coordination, the psychological impact of the hidden advantage was profound. For the Japanese, entrenched in fortified positions, the unyielding forward momentum of an enemy they could neither predict nor fully understand created a sense of isolation. One Japanese officer recorded in his diary the sensation of watching the Marines vanish into the smoke and reappear where they should not be, speaking to each other across distances we cannot comprehend. Fear and disbelief became intertwined, eroding morale even before supplies ran low or casualties mounted. For the Americans, by contrast, the invisible connections forged by radios created confidence, cohesion, and an unshakable belief in their operational plan. The battlefield itself became a feedback loop, reinforcing initiative and rewarding adaptability. This hidden advantage was further amplified by specialized units that leveraged both technology and doctrine. Flamethrower teams, engineers, and assault units coordinated through radios to neutralize pillboxes that had been deemed impregnable. Mortars adjusted fire on the fly based on spotter reports, suppressing enemy positions and preventing organized counterattacks. Every technical innovation, whether radios, amphibious vehicles, or coordinated firepower, was integrated into the larger strategy of relentless adaptive assault. Japanese observers, seeing their fortifications systematically dismantled, could not comprehend the scale or speed of the operation. Their doctrine had trained them to resist, to fight to the last man, yet it offered no guidance for years, facing an adversary whose every movement was synchronized and supported invisibly by technological innovation. The result was an operational tempo that left the Japanese perpetually off balance. Where they expected to confront predictable waves of attackers, they found a constantly shifting battlefield, each element of which was coordinated through unseen threads of communication. The hidden advantage was not simply equipment. It was the interplay of doctrine, training, and technology that created an organism capable of pressing forward with unrelenting force. In the minds of the Japanese defenders, this was no longer a human enemy, but a force of nature, moving with machine-like precision, adapting to every countermeasure, and exploiting every weakness, as if guided by a single, unerring consciousness. By the time the first day's combat ended, the Americans had achieved objectives that had been deemed unlikely, if not impossible. Beachheads were secured, key ridges had fallen, and Japanese defensive lines had been disrupted not solely by brute force, but by an invisible network that bound every Marine into a cohesive whole. The combination of radios, coordinated units, and adaptive doctrine created a battlefield reality that the Japanese could neither predict nor counter effectively. In the fog, smoke, and cacophony of Iwo Jima, what the defenders could perceive was a relentless, unstoppable force, a manifestation of technology and strategy that turned relentless human courage into an operational advantage the enemy could neither see nor match. The engineering behind the Americans' hidden advantage was as impressive as the tactics it enabled. Every radio, every amphibious vehicle, and every piece of supporting equipment was the product of meticulous design, rigorous testing, and industrial ingenuity. The SCR-300 backpack radio, a marvel of 1940s technology, exemplified this. Weighing just 35 pounds, it contained more than 1,200 components, each soldered and calibrated to function under the harshest conditions imaginable. Engineers at Motorola had designed it to operate across variable frequencies with crystal-controlled stability, ensuring that the roar of artillery, the crackle of gunfire, and the hiss of incoming mortar rounds would not drown out communication. Its 3-mile range under ideal conditions allowed platoons and company-level units to remain in constant contact, coordinating movement, calling in fire support, and relaying intelligence with unprecedented efficiency. For the Japanese accustomed to relying on runners, signal flags, or static-prone radios, this was a technological revelation, a weapon as decisive as any artillery shell or machine gun. Handheld SCR-536 radios complemented the backpacks, offering squad leaders a nimble tool for direct control over skirmishes. Weighing less than a pound, these handy-talkies allowed Marines to communicate across short distances with clarity that defied the chaos around them. Each unit was trained to operate these devices intuitively, integrating radio use into the rhythm of combat. Engineers in Chicago had not merely invented a radio. They had created a battlefield nervous system, translating human intent into coordinated action and amplifying the Marines' natural speed and initiative. Japanese troops, watching attacks unfold with terrifying precision, could see the result but not the mechanism, and their reports frequently described a phenomenon that seemed supernatural in its coordination. Beyond communication, the Americans had revolutionized mobility. LVTs, landing vehicle tracked, were amphibious tractors capable of traversing the treacherous coral reefs and volcanic sand that had defeated previous assaults in the Pacific. Each LVT could carry a dozen Marines, supplies, or light weapons, moving over surf, sand, and obstacles that would immobilize ordinary vehicles. Their armor was light, but sufficient to protect against small arms fire, allowing engineers and assault troops to reach positions that would otherwise be isolated. Mortar teams, flamethrower squads, and riflemen all relied on these vehicles to maintain the relentless momentum that defined the Iwo Jima landing. Japanese defensive calculations, based on tidal ranges, sand density, and enemy fatigue, were rendered irrelevant by the sheer mobility these machines provided. Even the ordnance itself was optimized for integration with these systems. Naval bombardments were carefully calculated, delivering sufficient force to neutralize above-ground fortifications without creating impassable debris for advancing Marines. Airstrikes, coordinated with ground units via radio, were timed to suppress enemy positions at the precise moment of landing. Flamethrowers, designed to project fire over distances previously unachievable, allowed Marines to clear bunkers with minimal exposure, while engineers used explosive charges in coordination with advancing squads to breach reinforced positions. The combination of mobility, communication, and precision ordnance transformed every engagement into a controlled, adaptive sequence rather than a chaotic struggle of attrition. Factories across the United States worked tirelessly to ensure that production met the demands of this evolving doctrine. Motor plants in Detroit, accustomed to building automobiles, shifted to manufacturing LVTs and armored vehicles with astounding speed. Radio assembly lines churned out thousands of SCR-300 and SCR-536 units, each tested under simulated battlefield conditions to guarantee reliability. This industrial backbone was invisible to the Japanese observers on Iwo Jima, yet it was as critical to victory as any Marine on the beach. In essence, the Americans had weaponized the home front, converting engineering, production capacity, and logistical innovation into direct combat advantage. The inventors behind these technologies were often unsung heroes. Engineers like Henryk Magnuski, who developed the frequency modulation circuits for Motorola radios, or the design teams that refined LVT performance in the face of real-world amphibious challenges, were instrumental in creating tools that seamlessly integrated into marine doctrine. Their work exemplified a fusion of technical brilliance and practical battlefield necessity, demonstrating that innovation in war extended beyond tanks and bullets to the very means of coordination and mobility. Every component, soldered circuit, reinforced hull, calibrated explosive, was a thread in the larger tapestry of operational dominance. This technical superiority had immediate tactical implications. Radios enabled adaptive assaults, LVTs ensured continuous momentum, and ordnance integration allowed for calculated suppression of enemy positions. Japanese defenders, entrenched in fortified positions and expecting predictable frontal assaults, were consistently outmaneuvered. Machine guns and mortars, positioned for maximum effect, were often bypassed or neutralized before they could inflict lethal damage. Communications within Japanese units broke down under the pressure of an enemy who could coordinate attacks across distances that their runners or static signals could not match. The battlefield became a theater of confusion for the defenders. While the attackers operated as a cohesive organism, each element anticipating the next in a chain of precision-enabled movements. The scale of production also mattered. Thousands of radios, hundreds of LVTs, and a near-infinite stream of ammunition and supplies ensured that American forces could sustain the assault at a tempo that Japanese planners could not anticipate. Attrition, which had historically been a defender's advantage in the Pacific, was mitigated by redundancy, resupply, and continuous reinforcement. Every obstacle cleared by engineers, every pillbox neutralized by flamethrower teams, and every unit maneuver coordinated via radio was a testament to the seamless integration of technology, doctrine, and industrial capacity. This synthesis of engineering and strategy created an operational tempo so overwhelming that it undermined both morale and tactical planning on the Japanese side. By integrating technology into every facet of combat, the Americans transformed the Battle of Iwo Jima from a simple amphibious assault into a demonstration of networked warfare decades ahead of its time. Communication, mobility, and logistical support were not auxiliary elements. They were force multipliers that allowed the Marines to execute relentless, adaptive assaults under fire. Japanese observers could see only the effects: beachheads secured, ridges taken, and fortifications neutralized with an efficiency that defied their calculations. What they could not perceive was the invisible framework of engineering brilliance and industrial might that enabled such precision and relentless momentum, a hidden advantage that would define the course of the battle and leave an indelible mark on modern military thought. On February 20th, 1945, the first full-scale engagements for control of Iwo Jima's ridges began in earnest, and the battle quickly assumed a ferocity that would become legendary. The initial landing zones had been secured, but Japanese resistance was far from broken. Caves and pillboxes concealed entire regiments, pre-positioned to deliver devastating counterattacks. One such strongpoint near Mount Suribachi became a focal point of the struggle. Japanese machine gunners, mortars, and flamethrower units waited in meticulously calculated positions, expecting to decimate any advancing wave. What they faced instead was an adaptive, coordinated onslaught that defied their assumptions. Marine units, moving with disciplined precision, used real-time intelligence relayed over SCR-300 and SCR-536 radios to navigate deadly zones, suppress key enemy positions, and exploit weak points with speed that left the defenders disoriented. The battlefield itself seemed to bend to the will of the attackers, as if the very landscape had been read, calculated, and conquered before the first shots were fired. In one pivotal engagement along the northern beaches, a battalion of Marines encountered a network of tunnels feeding into a fortified ridge. Japanese soldiers, confident in their preparation, unleashed a hail of fire that cut down waves of advancing troops. Yet the Americans responded with calculated coordination. Flamethrower teams advanced alongside engineers, armed with demolition charges, clearing bunker entrances, while riflemen suppressed enemy positions from flanking angles. Radios crackled constantly, calling for artillery barrages to shift with each newly identified threat, and providing real-time updates to adjacent units to prevent overlapping fire or missteps. Japanese defenders, expecting a slow frontal assault, found themselves unable to predict or counter the rapidly changing dynamics. Entire firing positions were neutralized before the enemy could react, and counterattacks were met with precise, overlapping fire from multiple directions. At Motoyama Airfield, the struggle became even more desperate. Japanese troops, occupying elevated positions and utilizing interlocking fields of fire, had prepared to hold until annihilation. Marines faced lethal machine gun nests and pre-sighted mortar positions, yet every advance was supported by continuous artillery from offshore, which adjusted on the fly based on forward observers' radio reports. Tanks, though vulnerable to hidden anti-tank weapons, maneuvered across volcanic terrain with surprising efficacy, shielding infantry and delivering suppressive fire that allowed squads to close in on strong points. Engineers detonated carefully placed charges, collapsing bunkers and sealing tunnels, while assault teams pressed forward. The Japanese could not comprehend the speed and synchronization of these combined arms tactics, and units that were supposed to hold in depth were systematically overwhelmed, not by sheer firepower alone, but by the integration of communication, mobility, and precise timing. The numbers tell a stark story. By the end of the third day, Marines had secured several critical ridges and sections of the airfield, while Japanese reports indicated catastrophic losses in positions once deemed impregnable. A single Japanese battalion, stationed along a northern ridge, reported a staggering 60% casualty rate within the first 48 hours of combat. Field commanders noted with disbelief that American units, after sustaining heavy casualties, continued to press forward without pause, immediately reinforced by reserves that had landed in subsequent waves. Observers on the island recorded moments where entire squads disappeared behind smoke and terrain, only to reappear in flanking positions as if anticipating every defensive maneuver. The psychological impact on the defenders was profound. Disbelief gave way to terror, and disciplined defense began to fracture under the relentless tempo of the assault. Individual engagements highlight the tactical genius and adaptability of American forces. On one occasion, a heavily fortified pillbox complex near a volcanic ridge held out against repeated frontal assaults. Rather than committing to attrition, Marine commanders coordinated a combined assault. Flamethrowers cleared secondary entrances. Engineers breached walls, mortars, and artillery suppressed firing positions. An infantry unit struck from unexpected angles, all synchronized via radio. The pillbox was neutralized in less than 2 hours, an operation that would have taken days under traditional assault methods. Japanese reports describe the scene with astonishment, noting the vanishing of attacking units from expected locations and their sudden reappearance in positions that defied logic. For the defenders, every moment of adaptive response was met with another unanticipated assault, creating a cycle of confusion and attrition that systematically eroded both morale and manpower. Mount Suribachi itself became a microcosm of the battle. Japanese defenders occupied a network of tunnels and fortified positions that dominated the surrounding terrain. Every ridge, every approach, had been pre-sighted for machine guns and mortars. Yet the Americans, utilizing combined arms tactics with radio-guided coordination, artillery support, and engineering ingenuity, ascended the slopes in a series of meticulously timed assaults. Flamethrower teams and demolition units cleared bunkers, while rifle squads suppressed remaining defenders. Tanks and LVTs delivered both firepower and protective cover, allowing infantry to move across terrain that would have been impossible under fire. Each phase of the assault was choreographed, yet executed with adaptability, ensuring that obstacles were overcome in real time. Japanese soldiers, witnessing positions collapse sequentially despite their careful planning, described the Americans as an unstoppable tide that could not be reasoned with or halted. Across the island, similar engagements unfolded simultaneously. Marines adapted to volcanic terrain, collapsed caves and hidden pillboxes, with methods honed through prior campaigns in the Pacific. Radio communication allowed for instantaneous tactical adjustments. Artillery fire was redirected within seconds, while small unit leaders maneuvered forces to exploit enemy weaknesses as they emerged. The Japanese, trained to rely on pre-planned fields of fire and sequential defensive layers, found themselves unable to impose order on a battlefield that shifted faster than anticipated. Reports from Japanese commanders frequently note the disorientation caused by unseen communication networks guiding the enemy's movements. What they perceived as unpredictability was in fact a sophisticated orchestration of coordination, mobility, and technical advantage, rendering even the most elaborate defensive preparations insufficient. By the end of the first week, the Americans had gained critical footholds, yet the cost was immense. Casualties were high, terrain was scarred, and the intensity of combat was unmatched. Still, the operational principle, the integration of technology, doctrine, and relentless human courage, proved decisive. Japanese resistance, though fierce and fanatical, was systematically undermined by an adversary that could adapt faster than it could react. Reports from survivors and field officers recount the psychological toll. Defenders in caves, isolated from command and witnessing repeated failures of fortified positions, experienced a profound sense of dislocation and fear. In contrast, Marines bound by communication, coordination, and shared momentum pressed forward with an almost unbreakable cohesion, illustrating the lethal effectiveness of a force united not just by training and bravery, but by the invisible threads of technological and doctrinal superiority. The relentless pace of the American assault had consequences far beyond the physical battlefield. As the first waves of Marines secured beachheads and penetrated ridgelines, the psychological impact on Japanese defenders became increasingly profound. Soldiers, trained in the doctrine of Bushido to hold their positions to the last man, found themselves confronting an enemy whose coordination and persistence defied their deepest expectations. Isolated in caves, tunnels, and pillboxes, Japanese units experienced a growing sense of disconnection from one another. Orders, once clear and actionable, became meaningless in the face of a dynamic, adaptive enemy that could strike where least expected. The Marines' integrated communications and rapid maneuvering created a battlefield in which traditional hierarchies and defensive calculations dissolved. For many defenders, the terror was not solely in facing firepower, but in witnessing an opponent whose every action seemed preordained, every movement anticipating their own. Reports from Japanese commanders highlight this breakdown. In a diary entry from an officer defending the northern ridges, he described the experience as facing ghosts that move with the precision of men, but with the inevitability of the tide. Entire platoons, once disciplined and coordinated, began to fracture under sustained assault. Units that had been trained to cover each other, to interlock fields of fire and protect flanks, found those lines useless against Marines who appeared unpredictably, striking from unexpected directions, with supporting fire coordinated through radios. Morale, a crucial component of any defensive operation, eroded rapidly as the psychological weight of relentless, adaptive attacks mounted. Panic spread quietly but inexorably, undermining both the will to fight and the ability to act strategically. The Americans, conversely, drew strength from this very network of coordination. The integrated use of radios, combined arms tactics, and small unit initiative created a feedback loop that enhanced both confidence and cohesion. Leaders could issue orders that were received instantaneously across dispersed units, allowing for rapid reassignment of objectives, the reinforcement of vulnerable positions, and immediate adaptation to enemy counterattacks. Marines reported a heightened sense of connection, a shared awareness of the battlefield that transcended individual vulnerability. Even amidst the smoke, fire, and carnage, units operated with a cohesion that converted chaos into decisive action. This psychological advantage, connection versus isolation, was as lethal as any rifle, artillery shell, or tank round. The influence of these dynamics extended beyond individual engagements to shape the broader campaign. Japanese defensive doctrines, predicated on static positions and attritional defense, were increasingly untenable. The Americans' ability to coordinate and adapt in real time meant that positions designed to hold indefinitely were neutralized quickly, often with minimal casualties to the attackers relative to expectations. Field reports noted that entire defensive networks, previously considered impenetrable, collapsed not under overwhelming firepower alone, but under the sustained pressure of coordinated assaults, continuous momentum, and the psychological strain imposed on defenders who could neither anticipate nor counter the enemy's movements. The effect on Japanese leadership was acute. Officers faced not only the physical challenge of mounting a counterattack under constant pressure, but also the erosion of trust and morale among their own troops. Orders went unheeded, units became isolated, and the meticulous planning that had underpinned the island's fortifications unraveled. Commanders observed that even disciplined soldiers, when subjected to unrelenting, unpredictable pressure, succumbed to panic, hesitation, or impulsive action. The integrated network of American communication and coordination had transformed the battlefield into a psychological as well as physical weapon, magnifying the effects of every maneuver, suppression and assault. For the Marines, the psychological advantage reinforced operational effectiveness. Units maintained momentum despite casualties, coordinated flanking maneuvers across cratered terrain, and responded instantaneously to emerging threats. Observers noted that morale remained remarkably high, even under extreme stress, as soldiers understood that every movement was supported, every action amplified by the broader network. The result was a force capable of pressing relentlessly, maintaining cohesion in the face of adversity, and exploiting every tactical opportunity presented by Japanese mistakes or overextensions. Connection became power, and speed became dominance. The cumulative effect of this psychological and operational dynamic was evident in the sequence of battles across the island. Defensive positions that should have held for days were neutralized in hours. Counterattacks were preempted or blunted before they could achieve impact. Japanese troops, forced to fight from caves and tunnels with limited visibility of the battlefield, struggled to anticipate movements that were constantly shifting, coordinated, and reinforced. Fear and disbelief compounded, eroding both discipline and morale, and creating openings that the Americans exploited with lethal efficiency. This imbalance of psychological weight, combined with technological and tactical advantages, decisively shaped the flow of combat across Iwo Jima. Beyond the immediate tactical and operational impacts, the psychological dimension influenced strategic planning for both sides. American commanders recognized the value of sustained momentum, integration of communication, and adaptability as force multipliers that could reduce casualties and accelerate victory. Japanese planners, conversely, were confronted with the limitations of doctrine, preparation, and static fortifications when faced with an opponent capable of dynamic, coordinated assaults under extreme conditions. The Battle of Iwo Jima thus became not only a test of firepower and endurance, but also a case study in the profound influence of connectivity, morale, and psychological resilience in modern warfare. As the island campaign progressed, the psychological toll on Japanese defenders was mirrored by the confidence and cohesion of the American forces. Where one side fractured under stress, the other thrived under connection. Where one side hesitated in disbelief, the other advanced relentlessly. The battle became a study in contrasts: isolation versus networked communication, paralysis under fire versus adaptive initiative, despair under relentless assault versus morale bolstered by coordination. In this way, the hidden advantage, the integration of communication, mobility, and technology, manifested as both a tangible and psychological weapon, shaping not only the outcome of individual engagements, but the broader strategic landscape of the Pacific Theater. By the end of February, it was clear that the Americans' operational and psychological edge had fundamentally altered the nature of the battle. Japanese defenders, despite skill, courage, and preparation, could not overcome the relentless, coordinated pressure of a force that combined doctrine, technology, and unbreakable morale. Connection, speed, and adaptability had triumphed over static defense and rigid planning. Illustrating a lesson that would echo far beyond Iwo Jima, In modern warfare, the ability to coordinate, adapt, and sustain momentum can outweigh even the most formidable fortifications and the fiercest resistance. The legacy of the Marines' relentless assault on Iwo Jima reverberates far beyond the volcanic ridges and black sand beaches where men fought and died. The battle became a touchstone for the evolution of modern warfare, illustrating that technology, coordination, and doctrinal innovation could redefine the balance between attacker and defender. Radios, LVTs, integrated artillery, and adaptive tactics were not mere tools. They were enablers of a networked combat philosophy that emphasized speed, connection, and relentless momentum. Post-war military analysts recognized that the principles forged on Iwo Jima would shape conflicts for decades, from Korea to Vietnam, the Gulf War, and the network-centric operations of the 21st century. The notion that an informed, connected force could outmaneuver, outpace, and outthink a numerically or fortification-advantaged opponent became a central tenet of military strategy. Field Marshal Keitel of Germany might have underestimated the Americans' ability to synchronize technology and initiative during the European campaigns, but the lessons from Iwo Jima offered a broader, universal truth. In modern combat, connection can outweigh firepower, and adaptability can defeat even the most entrenched defense. The Japanese soldiers who faced the assault, fighting to the last man, demonstrated courage beyond measure. Yet the very structure of their defenses, a fortress of tunnels, pillboxes, and pre-sighted mortars, could not withstand an enemy that integrated communication, mobility, and precision into every movement. The Americans' ability to orchestrate a living, breathing combat organism, where each marine, vehicle, and artillery piece operated as part of a unified whole, revealed a paradigm shift in operational thought. No longer could brute force alone dictate outcomes. Coordination, speed, and adaptive response had become decisive. The engineers, inventors, and industrial workers who had supplied the radios, LVTs, flamethrowers, and ordnance were silent partners in this victory. Their innovations, born in factories and design labs thousands of miles from the beaches of Iwo Jima, were instrumental in shaping the battlefield reality. Motorola engineers who perfected FM radio circuits, industrial designers who refined amphibious vehicle performance, and assembly lines that churned out equipment at unprecedented scale were as critical to the outcome as the Marines storming ridges under fire. This fusion of technological ingenuity and human courage underscored a new form of warfare, one where victory relied on the seamless integration of innovation, production, and tactical execution. The psychological imprint of Iwo Jima also left a lasting legacy. The ability of a connected, coordinated force to sustain momentum under extreme conditions became a blueprint for future military operations. The Marines' cohesion, bolstered by real-time communication, ensured that even under relentless enemy fire, units could act decisively, exploit weaknesses, and maintain morale. For adversaries, the shock of facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate every defensive maneuver highlighted the importance of adaptability, intelligence, and anticipation in modern combat. Military theorists would later analyze these dynamics, recognizing that the interplay between psychological resilience and technological advantage could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. In the broader scope of history, Iwo Jima demonstrated that warfare had evolved beyond simple calculations of firepower, fortifications, and troop numbers. The battle illuminated the critical importance of networked operations, flexible doctrine, and the integration of technological advantage into every level of planning and execution. Commanders, planners, and soldiers who would fight in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf would draw lessons from this crucible, applying the principles of connection, speed, and adaptability to achieve operational success. The notion that a smaller, well-coordinated force could overcome even the most formidable defenses became a central tenet of modern military thinking, shaping doctrine, training, and procurement for decades to come. Beyond the tactical and strategic lessons, Iwo Jima became a symbol of human courage and the price of relentless determination. The Marines' willingness to press forward under extreme fire, the Japanese defenders' resolve to fight to the last, And the engineers' and inventors' tireless contributions all coalesced into a narrative that transcended the immediate conflict. The battle was not only a tactical victory, but a demonstration of the human capacity to adapt, innovate, and endure under conditions that seemed insurmountable. Every ridge seized, every bunker neutralized, every casualty endured was part of a larger testament to the integration of human will, technology, and strategic foresight. Modern military planners continue to study Iwo Jima as a case study in operational excellence and psychological warfare. The lessons extend beyond any single theater. Speed, adaptability, and connection can determine outcomes against even the most disciplined and fortified opponent. The battle also underscored the importance of logistics, industrial support, and technical innovation as force multipliers, illustrating that victory is rarely the product of courage alone, but of a holistic integration of human, technological, and organizational factors. In this way, Iwo Jima remains a benchmark for understanding the dynamics of modern combat and the interplay between innovation, doctrine, and psychological resilience. Ultimately, the enduring lesson of Iwo Jima is both simple and profound. In war, as in life, connection outweighs isolation, adaptability outpaces rigidity, and relentless determination, when coupled with intelligence, innovation, and coordination, can overcome even the most formidable obstacles. The American Marines who stormed the beaches, overcoming volcanic ridges, entrenched defenders, and near-impossible odds, embodied this principle with every step. Their victory was not solely a triumph of firepower or courage, but of integrated strategy, technological advantage, and human perseverance. And in this, the Battle of Iwo Jima continues to resonate across generations, reminding all who study it that in the theater of war, as in the theater of existence, unity, adaptability, and relentless execution are the forces that shape history itself.